Have you ever considered how the fate of millions, the destiny of empires, and the very map of the world could hinge on the last, ragged breath of a single man, not a great general, not a brilliant philosopher, but a man so broken, so cursed by his own bloodline, that his people called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched? Imagine a king ruling over a global empire, from Madrid to Manila, from Naples to Mexico, yet unable to chew his own food, unable to sire an heir, a man whose entire life was a slow, agonizing decay. This was Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain. His life was a tragedy, but his death was an apocalypse. For decades, the courts of Europe had watched him like vultures, circling, waiting. They didn't watch for his recovery. They watched for his final shudder. Because his death would not bring peace. It would unleash a storm of ambition, a clash of titans that would drown a continent in blood. The question wasn't if a war would come, but who would strike first when the frail heart of the Spanish Empire finally ceased to beat. The year is 1700. In the cavernous, cold halls of the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, a suffocating silence hangs in the air, broken only by the frantic muttering of prayers and the weak gasps of the king. Charles II is dying. For 35 years, he had been a ghost on his own throne, a living symbol of a dynasty that had devoured itself from within through generations of inbreeding. He was the end of the line, and with no child, no clear successor, his vast inheritance Spain, its Italian territories, the Spanish Netherlands, and the immeasurable wealth of the Americas was a prize of unimaginable proportions. It was a poisoned chalice, offered to a world already teetering on the brink of conflict. Two great families, the Bourbons of France and the Habsburgs of Austria, both claimed the prize through tangled webs of marriage and blood. Both knew that whoever inherited this throne would not just rule Spain, they would dominate Europe. The balance of an entire continent rested on the signature of a man barely capable of holding a pen. This isn't just a story about kings and queens. It's a story about how personal biology can become global politics. It's about how a family's obsession with pure blood led to the creation of a man so genetically damaged he became a domino, and his fall would trigger a chain reaction that no one could control. The War of the Spanish Succession was not a war of ideology. It was a family feud on a global scale, a bitter, bloody inheritance dispute between cousins, uncles, and nephews who commanded armies of millions. Forget political theory, forget nationalism. For 13 brutal years, Europe became the violent playground of two competing bloodlines. The central question that haunted every court, every cabinet, every battlefield was this: when the last branch of a mighty tree withers and dies, who has the right to claim the forest? And more importantly, what price are they willing to pay to take it? The paradox at the heart of this conflict is one of profound irony. For centuries, the great fear of Europe was the universal monarchy, the consolidation of too much power under one ruler. The Habsburgs themselves had been the source of this fear. The empire of Charles V in the 16th century, stretching from Vienna to Peru, had haunted the dreams of French kings for generations. France's foreign policy, under the cunning Cardinal Richelieu and later the Sun King, Louis XIV, was almost entirely dedicated to one goal: breaking the Habsburg encirclement. France was surrounded by Habsburg lands, Spain to the south, the Holy Roman Empire to the east, the Spanish Netherlands to the north. Now, through a bizarre twist of genetic fate, the French monarchy's greatest enemy was offering it the ultimate prize. The will of Charles II, influenced by a pro-French faction at court. named as his successor Philip, Duke of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV himself. This was the ultimate geopolitical earthquake. Why would a Spanish king, the last of his Habsburg line, betray his own blood and hand his empire to his ancestral enemy? The decision was not born of love for France, but of fear for Spain. The Spanish court was fiercely divided. One faction, loyal to the family name, supported the Austrian claimant, the Archduke Charles, the younger son of the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. To them, passing the crown to another Habsburg was the natural, moral choice. It preserved the dynasty, but another, more pragmatic faction saw the grim reality. Spain was weak, its armies hollowed out, its finances in ruins. The Austrian Habsburgs were far away and relatively weak at sea. If Spain chose the Austrian heir, they knew Louis XIV, the most powerful monarch in Europe, would attack immediately to seize parts of the empire. They believed that only by making Louis XIV's own grandson the King of Spain could they ensure the Sun King would protect the empire's integrity rather than dismember it. It was a desperate gamble to save the empire. They had to give it to the enemy. This created an impossible contradiction for the rest of Europe, particularly for the maritime powers England and the Dutch Republic. For them, a Bourbon on the Spanish throne was a nightmare scenario. It would create a Franco-Spanish superpower, a Catholic hyper-monarchy controlling the two greatest armies on the continent, the wealth of the New World, and a vast colonial trade network. French economic and military dominance would be absolute. The balance of power, the delicate equilibrium that prevented any one nation from overwhelming the others, would be shattered. And so, they faced a terrible choice. Do they accept the will of a dead king and allow the creation of a monster that could devour them all? Or do they defy that will, champion the rival claimant, and plunge an entire continent into a war of almost unimaginable scale and cost? The tragedy is that there was no peaceful option. The moment the ink dried on Charles's will, the cannons were already being loaded. The war was inevitable. The only question left to answer was how many would have to die to settle this family squabble. Let us return to that suffocating death chamber in Madrid. Try to place yourself in the mind of Charles the Thumaican. Your entire life has been a public spectacle of suffering. You've been subjected to endless medical procedures, bleedings, purges, and even exorcisms to cure the demonic possession they claimed was the cause of your impotence and illness. You are the product of 11 marriages between close relatives over 2 centuries. The famous Habsburg jaw is so pronounced in you that your upper and lower teeth do not meet. You can barely speak. And every meal is an agonizing ordeal of swallowing food whole. You are 38, but you look like a man of 80. You know you are the end, the weight of centuries, the legacy of Caesar and the conquistadors, rests on your frail shoulders. Priests and ministers drone on at your bedside, urging you, pressuring you. One side speaks of loyalty to the House of Austria, to your family name. The other speaks of the survival of Spain, of making a deal with the devil, Louis XIV, to keep your empire from being torn to pieces by jackals. You are weak. You are in pain. You are confused. Finally, with what little strength you have left, you make your choice. You sign the document that disinherits your own kin and names Philip of Anjou your heir. A month later, on November 1st, 1700, you die. Did you feel a sense of peace, believing you had saved Spain, or did you, in your final moments, hear the distant thunder of the approaching armies, knowing you had just condemned a generation to death? The news reaches Versailles, Louis XIV, the Sun King, at the zenith of his power, gathers the court. He presents his 17-year-old grandson, a shy, devout, and politically naive boy. In a moment of supreme arrogance and triumph, Louis declares, "Il n'y a plus de Pyrénées." There are no more Pyrenees. The mountain range that had separated France and Spain for eternity was in his mind, erased by a single stroke of a pen. The young Philip V travels to Madrid, welcomed by a Spanish populace weary of uncertainty and hopeful that a new, vigorous dynasty can reverse decades of decline. But Louis XIV's hubris knows no bounds. He issues letters patent-preserving Philip's right to the French throne, raising the terrifying prospect of a future personal union of the two crowns. He sends French troops into the Spanish Netherlands, expelling Dutch garrisons. He secures for French merchants the coveted asiento, the monopoly on the slave trade with the Spanish colonies. These were not the actions of a king respecting Spanish independence. They were the actions of a master taking possession of a new property. In London, in Amsterdam, in Vienna, the response is fury. The Grand Alliance is reborn. England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire unite under one cause to drive Philip V from Spain and place their own candidate, Archduke Charles, on the throne. The world now has two kings of Spain, and a war is the only way to decide which one is real. The war that followed was a true world war, fought on a scale not seen before in Europe. It was fought in Italy, in Germany, in the Netherlands, and, most brutally, in Spain itself, which became a battlefield for its own soul. The conflict was personified by its brilliant generals. On the side of the alliance, there was the peerless English commander, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, a master of logistics and battlefield tactics. Alongside him was the equally brilliant Prince Eugene of Savoy, a French nobleman fighting for the Austrians. Together, they formed one of the most successful military partnerships in history, delivering crushing defeats to the French at the battles of Blenheim in 1704, Ramillies in 1706, and Oudenarde in 1708. These weren't just battles, they were butcheries that shattered the myth of French invincibility. Meanwhile, Spain itself descended into a vicious civil war. The region of Catalonia, fearing the centralizing tendencies of a Bourbon king, rose up in fervent support of the Habsburg claimant, Archduke Charles, who landed in Barcelona and was proclaimed King Charles III. For years, the peninsula was a hellscape of sieges, scorched earth campaigns, and guerrilla warfare. Peasants who had never heard of the balance of power were forced to choose between Felipe and Carlos, fighting and dying for two foreign princes. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a Spanish farmer in Aragon. An army approaches your village. Do you support the French-born Philip, the king in Madrid, whose forces might protect you but demand all your grain? Or do you support the Austrian-born Charles, the king in Barcelona, whose allies promise ancient liberties but whose armies might loot your home anyway? What is loyalty when your world is on fire? Comment your thoughts below. To truly understand why this war happened, we must move from the throne room to the laboratory and look at the biological source code of the crisis genetics. The House of Habsburg, in its obsession with keeping power and territory within the family, practiced a level of consanguineous marriage that is staggering. They weren't just marrying first cousins. They were marrying uncles to nieces, aunts to nephews, creating a tangled, recursive family tree. The genetic consequences were devastating. This practice dramatically increased the probability of recessive, harmful genes expressing themselves. The result was the infamous Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, a severe underbite that grew more pronounced with each generation. But it was far more than a cosmetic issue. Charles II was the tragic culmination of this genetic nightmare. His inbreeding coefficient was calculated to be 0.254 higher than the offspring of a brother-sister union. He suffered from at least 2 genetic disorders, pituitary hormone deficiency, which likely explains his short stature and delayed development, and distal renal tubular acidosis, a kidney disorder that causes metabolic problems and can affect bone health. His legendary impotence, the very fact that left the throne vacant, was almost certainly a direct result of this inherited genetic collapse. In essence, the Habsburg dynasty had bred itself into extinction. The war was not just caused by a political vacuum. It was caused by a biological one, created by centuries of deliberate, systematic inbreeding. The very strategy designed to preserve their power was the one that ultimately destroyed it. Beyond the biology, we must examine the psychology of the main actors. Louis XIV was not simply a greedy monarch. He was the embodiment of the 17th century concept of la gloire, glory. His entire reign was a performance of power, from the construction of Versailles to his meticulously crafted public image. Placing his grandson on the Spanish throne was his ultimate masterpiece, the final, undeniable confirmation of his and France's supremacy. It was an act of supreme narcissistic fulfillment. On the other side, we have Emperor Leopold I in Vienna, a deeply religious and less flamboyant ruler. He was nonetheless driven by a powerful dynastic pride and a deep-seated sense of entitlement. The Spanish throne, in his mind, belonged to the House of Habsburg by right of blood and history. His son, Archduke Charles, was thrust into this role, embodying his father's ambitions. Then consider the 2 young claimants themselves. Philip V was described as quiet, melancholic, and deeply pious, but also prone to severe bouts of depression, what was then called melancholia, and what we might now call bipolar disorder. He was a puppet, first of his grandfather, Louis XV, and later of his formidable wife, Maria Louisa of Savoy, and the powerful Princesse des Ursins. He was a king who often seemed to have little will of his own, a passenger in the war for his own crown. Archduke Charles was perhaps more outgoing and martial, but he too was a pawn in a larger game, a symbol for a coalition to rally around. The war was driven by the collision of these personalities, the Sun King's unbridled ambition, the Emperor's stubborn pride, and the insecurities of 2 young men who were little more than gilded chess pieces. Finally, from a sociological and political science perspective, the war reveals a fundamental truth about the early modern state. Today, we think of a state as a nation, a people bound by common culture, language, and territory. In 1700, the state was not a nation. It was a dynastic possession. It was the personal property of the ruling family. The Spanish Empire was not Spain's. It was the King of Spain's. This is why a will, a simple instrument of inheritance, could transfer continents. The millions of people living in these territories were, in essence, part of the estate, passed from one owner to another like land or livestock. Their consent was not required. The concept of the balance of power was the international system that arose to manage this reality. It was a cold, amoral calculation among the elite ruling families of Europe. It was not about justice or self-determination. It was a mechanism to prevent any one family from becoming so powerful that it could threaten the possessions of the others. The War of the Spanish Succession was the ultimate expression of this system, a brutal, 13-year-long corrective measure, a rebalancing of the great European family firms, paid for with the lives of over 1 million soldiers and civilians who had no stake in the inheritance. It was the peak and the crisis point of the dynastic state, just before the dawn of the age of nationalism. Let's pause and consider the central irony of this entire bloody affair. The Grand Alliance went to war for one primary reason: to prevent a Bourbon from sitting on the Spanish throne and, crucially, to prevent the possibility of the crowns of France and Spain ever being united on a single head. They spent over a decade and 1 million lives pursuing this goal. Then, in 1711, a random act of biology rendered the entire calculus moot. The Holy Roman Emperor, Joseph the Piton, died of smallpox. His younger brother, the alliance's candidate for the Spanish throne, Archduke Charles, suddenly inherited the entire Austrian Habsburg dominion and was elected Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI. Suddenly, the nightmare scenario was reversed. If the alliance succeeded in placing Charles on the Spanish throne, he would unite the Spanish and Austrian empires, recreating the very same kind of superstate they had been fighting to prevent. The cure had become the disease for Great Britain and the Dutch Republic. A union of Spain and Austria was just as dangerous as a union of Spain and France. Their entire war aim became obsolete overnight. It's a moment of profound historical absurdity. The very man they had championed was now the one they had to abandon. This twist forces us to ask a deeply philosophical question. What is the true nature of loyalty in conflict? The Catalans had fought and died for years, sacrificing everything for their chosen king, Carlos III. Their loyalty was to him, to the Habsburg cause, and to the ancient regional privileges they believed he would protect. But for their powerful allies, Britain and the Netherlands, loyalty was never to a person. It was to an abstract concept, the balance of power. The moment Charles became more of a threat than a solution, they began secret negotiations with France, effectively betraying their Spanish allies. The Catalans were left to their fate, besieged and ultimately crushed by the forces of Philip V. Their fierce loyalty was met with cold, pragmatic abandonment. It highlights the brutal difference between fighting for a cause you believe in and being a pawn in someone else's strategic game. Are principles universal, or are they merely tools, to be used and discarded as convenience dictates? This war suggests that for the great powers, principles were and perhaps still are the ultimate luxury, easily sacrificed at the altar of self-interest. How does a conflict like this compare to the wars of the modern era? We tell ourselves that we have evolved. We no longer fight over a king's inheritance. We fight for ideology, democracy versus fascism, communism versus capitalism. We fight for national security, for resources, for human rights. But are they truly so different? A dynastic war is, at its core, a war over who controls the levers of power and resources. The state was the family's property. Today, is it so different when nations go to war over spheres of influence, over control of oil fields, trade routes, or critical minerals? The language has changed. We've replaced dynastic right with national interest. We've replaced the king's glory with the nation's prestige. But has the fundamental human driver, the pursuit of power, security, and wealth at the expense of others, truly changed? Or have we simply become more sophisticated in the justifications we create for the same brutal calculus? The War of the Spanish Succession holds up a dark mirror, forcing us to ask whether our modern conflicts are as enlightened as we pretend, or if they are just another verse in the same ancient, bloody song. the ghost of the War of the Spanish Succession haunts our world in ways most of us never realize. Look at a map. The fact that a Bourbon king, Felipe VI, sits on the throne of Spain today is a direct result of this conflict. The Bourbon dynasty, installed by Louis XIV's power play, survived, creating the modern Spanish state. Look at the Rock of Gibraltar, that peculiar piece of Britain jutting out from the coast of Spain. It wasn't won in a recent conflict. It was seized by an Anglo-Dutch fleet in 1704 in the name of Archduke Charles, and then formally ceded to Great Britain in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 as part of their price for abandoning the Habsburg cause. For over 300 years, it has remained a strategic naval base and a persistent thorn in Anglo-Spanish relations, a physical, rock-solid relic of this ancient family feud. The war marked the definitive rise of Great Britain as a global maritime and commercial power, and the beginning of the end for the Dutch Golden Age. It confirmed the decline of Spain as a hegemonic power and the containment of French ambition. The lines drawn on the map at Utrecht shaped the contours of Western Europe for a century, setting the stage for the next round of conflicts. The very concept of ending a war through international treaty, creating a new, mutually agreed-upon status quo, was refined and solidified by this conflict. The Treaty of Utrecht was a landmark piece of diplomacy. It wasn't a simple victory for one side. It was a complex, messy, and deeply cynical compromise. Philip V was allowed to keep the throne of Spain and its colonies, but only after renouncing any claim to the French throne forever. The Spanish Netherlands became the Austrian Netherlands. Spain ceded its Italian possessions to Austria and Savoy. France ceded territory in North America to Britain. It was a trade-off, a rebalancing of the books. This model of conflict resolution, ending a massive war, not with total annihilation, but with a multilateral Congress that reshuffles the deck of territories and spheres of influence, became the template for the next 200 years. From the Congress of Vienna after Napoleon to the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, the war taught Europe a painful lesson that total victory might be impossible or even undesirable, and that a negotiated, balanced peace, however unsatisfying, is often the only way to move forward. But perhaps the most profound modern echo is in the concept of the proxy war and the fight for spheres of influence. The Spanish people themselves were, in many ways, the victims of a proxy war between the great powers. Their country was the arena where France and the Grand Alliance settled their scores. Does this not sound familiar throughout the Cold War? And even today, we see powerful nations backing opposing sides in regional conflicts in Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Ukraine. The local combatants fight and die for their own immediate reasons, but their struggle is fueled, funded, and armed by larger powers who are playing a global chess game. The language is no longer of dynastic inheritance, but of geopolitical strategy, of securing buffer states, of containing rivals, of protecting access to resources. The War of the Spanish Succession shows us that this is not a new phenomenon. The tragic fate of Spain, and especially Catalonia, serves as a timeless warning to smaller nations when giants fight. It is the grass that gets trampled. The struggle for self-determination can be easily co-opted and just as easily abandoned by powerful patrons whose ultimate loyalty is only to themselves. In the end, the war concluded with a bitter irony. A Bourbon sat on the Spanish throne, which was a victory for France. But Spain was weakened, its empire partitioned, and the crowns of France and Spain were forbidden from ever uniting, which was a victory for the Grand Alliance. Everyone got something, and everyone lost something. Philip V ruled as King of Spain for 46 years, a reign marked by bouts of deep mental illness, but also by significant administrative reforms that centralized the Spanish state. Archduke Charles ruled as Holy Roman Emperor, spending much of his reign trying to secure his own daughter's inheritance, leading to yet another succession war after his death. The great generals, Marlborough and Eugene, saw their fame and influence fade. The cost was staggering. Estimates range from 700,000 to over 1.3 million dead. Economies were shattered, lands were devastated, and a generation was scarred. All of this, stemming from the tragic biology of one man and the boundless ambition of his relatives. The hidden past is not just about recounting events. It's about listening for the echoes. When we look at the bitter political divisions in Spain today, some of them can trace their roots back to the allegiances of this war, the centralism of the Bourbons versus the regionalism defended by places like Catalonia. When we discuss the nature of international alliances like NATO, we are discussing the modern incarnation of the balance of power. When we see conflicts fueled by outside powers, we are seeing the ghost of Spain's tragedy. The past is never truly dead, because the human behaviors that drive it, ambition, fear, pride, greed, and the desperate search for security, are immortal. The names on the thrones change. The flags are redesigned. The weapons become more deadly. But the game often remains the same. So we are left with a final unsettling thought. Charles II, El Hechizado, was seen as a monstrous failure, a king whose reign was a curse upon his land. Yet, in a way, his weakness simply pulled back the curtain on the world, as it truly was a ruthless system of power politics where bloodlines were assets and entire populations were expendable. He was not the cause of the darkness. He was merely the broken vessel that could no longer contain it, letting it spill out and consume the world. Was this family feud a grotesque anomaly, or was it a moment of horrifying clarity, revealing the true, brutal nature of power that we now try to conceal behind more palatable ideals? The answer is not in the history books. It is in the choices we make today. Thank you for joining The Hidden Past. If you find these journeys into the shadows of history compelling, subscribe and press the bell icon so you never miss an episode.